Welcome to Rosherville Gardens. Well, it doesn't quite look how it did when it was built. This used to be a grand entrance to what, in the Victorian period, was a beautiful pleasure garden. What I've seen described as the Euro Disney of the southeast of England. Now, however, it's obviously just some blocks of flats. But there are still a few signs around, although they're very hidden, of what used to be here. We're going to go for a walk around. We're going to go down the cliff and see if anything of the pleasure gardens remains down there where it was. And we're going to take a kind of rough tour of the area as it used to be, at least the bits that we can still get to.
We're going to find out why one of Kent and ultimately the UK's most popular attractions completely disappeared. And stick around to the end if you want to see the uniquely Victorian way I decided to get home. In its day, Rosherville Gardens was one of the largest and most popular Victorian pleasure gardens, and ultimately, despite various changes that we'll get into, survived for about 70 years. It was located between Northfleet and Gravesend in Kent in the UK, and as well as obviously being an incredibly attractive attraction for the people of Kent, was also incredibly popular with Londoners who made their way down on paddle steamers. Before the gardens were created, what used to be here was a disused chalk pit. About 16 acres of disused chalk pit. And when you look at the actual layout of the gardens, it was kind of strange. I mean, you can kind of see how they just squeezed it in between the roads that already existed here. It was very wide at the eastern end, got really narrow in the middle, and then just kind of petered out to the western end. And all of this land belonged to a man called Jeremiah Rosher, who I couldn't find any pictures of, so let's say he looked a bit like this, who lived in an old mansion just north of where the gardens eventually were. And the Rosher family were responsible for building a fancy new estate in the area, which they named Rosherville. And the Roshers had made their fortune in the chalk pits. But by around the 1830s, all of these old chalk pits were essentially just wasteland. And it seemed pretty clear that the Rosher family were pretty desperate to get rid of this horrible bit of land that was of no use to them anymore. And this is where a businessman named George Jones stepped in. Again, can't find any pictures, but Google gave me this cool guy. And what he saw in this disused chalk pit was a beautiful botanical garden. Gravesend at the time was flourishing, with its location on the Thames making it an attractive resort town, and the chalk pits also being very, very close to the river meant it was very accessible to visitors arriving by steamboat. Now, initially it seemed that George Jones had very high aspirations for his new attraction, not just wanting it to be a pleasure garden or theme park as we might call it today, but wanting it to have more of a, let's say, cultured and educational purpose. And he formed the Kent Zoological and Botanical Gardens Company. This company was then used to lease the chalk pit for 99 years, in 1837. So the idea was to make something along the lines of a mixture between Kew Gardens as we see it today and the Zoological Gardens in Regent's Park. And you can see why he maybe wanted to make it a little more sophisticated, because there wasn't a shortage of pleasure gardens, which were more, for recreational fun and entertainment. There were plenty of those around, closer to London, in Surrey, but George Jones wanted those high-class visitors. Once the lease had been signed, a week later, the gardens opened, and obviously there was not a lot going on. They'd started to map out some of the paths that would be in the gardens, but there was basically nothing there. Despite that though, about 150 people turned up for the opening, and they set up a marquee in the centre of the grounds and had a lovely banquet. Music was played from the Royal Marine Band, and many, many other onlookers watched from the tops of the cliffs. By 1838, a brick wall had been built around the grounds, and they bought the Rosherville Pier, starting to build their plan to make this a very accessible attraction for Londoners. Around this time, they also started to stockpile animals for the zoological attraction, including tigers and exotic birds. Over the following few years, the gardens were laid out, designed, and then planted. They tunneled through the chalk where they needed to, they put in various different animal dens for the animals that were going to be kept there, they planted the maze, they hired local builders to create the entrance lodge, and they cleared the ground for the hotel that would stand there, and they also built the iconic Gothic hall at the same time. And by 1840, the gardens were ready to properly open. But it wasn't smooth sailing. The gardens were very expensive to get into, and ultimately once you did get in, there wasn't a lot to do beyond walking around the gardens and looking at the few animals that were there. And by 1841, when they just weren't making enough money to keep going, they decided to transition the gardens into a pleasure garden. They threw gala events, and they brought entertainers to draw in the crowds. There were jugglers, sword swallowers, military bands. There was also apparently a chap called Herr von Joel who was very good at imitating birds and animals, and did a little yodeling on the side. Which actually doesn't sound too far off some of the noises that the inhabitants of Gravesend High Street still make in 2025. And I'm allowed to say that because I basically grew up in Gravesend, and have the kind of relationship with it that an abused spouse has with their abusive partner. They also brought in gift shops and started to sell fancy foods, and all of these different attractions slowly started to draw in more crowds. And by the time they had all of this, the music, the bands, the entertainers, the animals, the beautiful gardens, it all totted up to what actually made for quite a nice day out. Just maybe not as cultured and sophisticated as George Jones might have initially wanted. But hey, it was successful.
Here is the old clifftop entrance to Rosherville Gardens. Now, you're not going to see much. What remains are some parts of the old walls that lined the path that took you down and round, down the steps, down through the cliff, and then brought you out down the bottom into the pleasure gardens. And actually, on this side of the fence, there are still some signs of the walls or the paving that would have lined this grand walkway down to the entrance. I have seen photos and videos from urban explorers who've hopped over there and gone down the steps into the tunnel. I'm not that guy though, and those steps look way too close to the edge of that cliff for me, so we're just gonna get some shots from over here. And interestingly, in some of the photos that we have, we can see that back where the main road is over there was a huge tower and what looks like a kind of an arched entryway to get in, and I imagine that's probably where you paid for your tickets, you paid your sixpence, whatever it was, to get in. That's completely gone. It's amazing that if it weren't for this hidden ruin on the other side of the fence here, you would have no idea what this place used to look like. It's completely different. So where I'm stood right now would have been the last point before you walk down the steps, round the corner and down through the tunnel. And there's actually a photo of a little boy working his way down those steps to enter the pleasure gardens. Once you worked your way down those steps, through the tunnel and came out on the cliffside down below, you would have found yourself right at the top of the pleasure gardens, and that's where we're going to go next.
Now that the gardens were committed to being, a general entertainment attraction, they started to thrive. The Gothic hall that had been built was renamed the Baronial Hall after a man called Baron Nathan was brought in as Master of Ceremonies and held concerts and dances in the Baronial Hall every evening. Fireworks were also introduced as a new attraction, and the gardens were lit not just by the fireworks but by beautiful candles in glass jars strung from the trees throughout the gardens. And once the price was also reduced, the gardens became more and more popular. And by 1842, there were about 14,000 people a week coming to the gardens for the summer season. And apparently amongst the people arriving were even figures like the Prince of Wales, although incognito, as none of the royal family would ever have demeaned themselves to be seen there publicly. Most visitors would arrive by steamboat, hop off on Rosherville Pier, and make their way to the grand entrance on Birch Road. They'd pay their sixpence and enter the grounds through a grand arch to the high terrace. And apparently on the high terrace, there was a famous caged cockatoo that would chat to people as they arrived. And from this high terrace, visitors would get their first glimpse straight down the Italian gardens to the bear pit and beyond.
Welcome to the bottom of the stairs. Now, you might be able to tell from my haircut and slightly longer beard that this is definitely not the same day. I've been having to film this kind of piecemeal over the course of a few weeks. Just blame the weather more than anything else. But behind me here is the cliff. Now, there are a series of doors down here. I'm not sure whether they are some of the caves that used to run along here, where they were thinking about keeping the animals. They look maybe a little bit too modern, but they could have been, done up, closed off, whatever.
Well, it turns out those doors are actually the entrances to a huge air raid shelter. It was put there during the Second World War and could shelter up to 2,000 people, with 6 entrances, electric ventilation, toilets, and a first aid post. As you came down to the bottom of the cliff, you would have come out onto a small spit of raised land, and to your left would have been the open air theatre. This beautiful outdoor stage was built in around 1873-1874 on the old platform that had been there. It was opposite the Rosary platform and had side wings, trapdoors, everything that they needed for incredible ballets and gymnastic performances. And this is where free performances were put on that you couldn't see in the Bijou Theatre.
What is where the theatre was now is a building site. They're actually putting a primary school in here, so it's cool. I can think of worse things to build where an old theatre used to be, but you would have come down the cliff behind me and then turned left into what was essentially the entertainment party area of Rosherville Gardens, where you had the open air theatre, the actual Bijou Theatre, and various other things like dancing platforms and the baronial hall and things like that. This was really where the fun started to happen. A shame that at the moment it looks like a building site, but I mean, that just shows you how much this place has changed and is continuing to change. So to make our way through this section of the gardens, I'm just going to skirt around this building site. Now, this road that I'm walking along here, though not quite the same, is in fact the road that would have run along the outer edge of the gardens. And as I'm walking down here, on my left-hand side, about here, would have been the baronial hall. Now, obviously, again, it's a building site. We're not really seeing anything here, but this is roughly where it would have been.
The baronial hall was both a restaurant and a ballroom, and you can kind of picture it with busy waiters darting around tables that were lined down the side of the hall, whilst in the middle there were couples dancing to the various tunes that the bands would strike up. This brings us back to Baron Nathan, the man in charge of the hall. He was a dancing teacher, but when he arrived at Rosherville, he made the baronial hall his own. His real name was Barnet Nathan, and nobody could really narrow down whether he was actually a baron, but there was a general consensus that if he wasn't, he probably should have been. Described by most as incredibly popular, urbane, and courteous, with enormous charm. Although somebody else did describe him as a rather undersized man of very many pounds to the square inch, dignity and self-importance, whose marshal's baton, a collapsible opera hat, no reveller ventured to disregard. And an article in the Theatrical Journal in 1842 described him as being about 5'5" and always dressed in black. As well as his dancing, he apparently also thought himself a bit of a poet, and apparently produced a lot of poetry, although he was even made fun of in Punch for the, shall we say, lack of quality. Unfortunately, none of his writings appear to survive, so we'll just have to imagine what this, let's call him a character, would have produced. He also had a famous dance where he'd blindfold himself and then step around eggs. What can I say? That was, entertainment in the 1850s. But it became so popular that people would try and steal the eggs, and so eventually he unfortunately had to sack the whole thing off. In 1856, when the Baron was about 63, he died of a stroke, and thus Rosherville Gardens lost one of its most iconic fixtures. Between 1856 and the gardens closing, there were various other MCs, but it seems that none of them could quite live up to the reputation that he'd made for himself. Just in front of the baronial hall was a large space for dancing and firework displays. And apparently, an interesting game called Kiss in the Ring was played here, which involved a girl dropping a handkerchief behind her chosen partner and then him chasing her around until he caught her and claimed his kiss. And apparently, many real lasting marriages resulted from this game, which I guess I can get behind. I mean, I did meet my wife in a very similar way. I think it just involves slightly more alcohol. This dancing platform outside the baronial hall had kind of been built to take some of the flack and overflow dancers out of the hall itself. There was a bandstand in the middle, and around the outside were seats for people to rest on. And in the metal arches between the seats were roses, which is why the structure became known as the Rosary platform. And it could also have an awning raised over the top if it was raining. One of the local entertainers in this part of the gardens was a man called Lieutenant George Bircher Gale. And yes, I could only find this tiny image of him, so here's a slightly better one. Who grew famous for his balloon ascents. He would begin to ascend in his balloon, which had 2 canvas gondolas beneath it, one tucked inside the other. And when he got high enough, he'd lower the gondola on the outside, pop through a trapdoor in his gondola, and climb down into the lower one. From there, he would set off fireworks. You know, one of the safest things to do in a hot air balloon. But clearly safety wasn't necessarily the first thing on Lieutenant Gale's mind, as he was also an alcoholic and often performed drunk. And he died as he lived at the age of 56 in 1850 in France, when, again performing drunk, he was carried away by his balloon caught in the rigging, and ultimately fell to his death, with his body not located for days. For those gala nights, there were firework displays in the area outside the baronial hall, and also performances by tightrope walkers. Apparently, the fireworks displays were incredible, and in 1845 the man in charge was called Signor Gallini, even though he was actually a man called Joseph Gingell from Wiltshire. But despite his maybe less than exotic beginnings, he apparently did know how to put on a firework display. One of his first demonstrations was in honour of Senor Gomez, the archery instructor. This fiery effigy appears in the act of drawing a bow, from which during ignition it discharges with the same accuracy as its original would a fiery arrow, which strikes into the centre of a fiery target some yards distant. And apparently he would also put on displays such as flaming boats flying across the gardens. Really makes him sound like a bit of a Gandalf the Grey putting fireworks displays on for the hobbits in Hobbiton. But it didn't always go to plan, and in 1847 there was a particularly disastrous fireworks display. Apparently after one of his usual incredible fireworks displays, 500 rockets were set off. Unfortunately, some of those went off course and struck a wooden hut that was halfway up the cliff. This wouldn't necessarily have been a problem if this wasn't the hut where Gallini stored his gunpowder and fireworks. Everyone initially thought it was part of the display until the man himself came running down and telling everybody to get out at once. And just as everyone made it clear, the gunpowder and the hut were blown sky high. Fortunately, no one was hurt and nothing was massively damaged, although Gallini did lose about £150 worth of materials. In 1860, George Jones decided he wanted to pursue theatre. So, they built one. This annex built onto the north side of the baronial hall was called the Drawing Room Theatre, where there were short farces, comic ballets, and burlesques. After a while, the Drawing Room Theatre proved to not really be big enough for what they wanted to put on there. In 1873, the Bijou Theatre was created. The old Drawing Room Theatre became a dining saloon and cafe, and the Bijou Theatre seated 420 people, and it had a camera obscura at the back which was used to project different backgrounds onto the stage.
Now, you can just about make out behind me here, roughly there, there's an area of cliff that sticks out just slightly more than the rest. And that is actually where quite a long section of cliff jutted out into the park. And that is where the iconic tower stood. Now, at some point, obviously when this was turned into an industrial site, it was cut down to make way for warehouses, whatever used to stand here. But for a long time, on this section of cliff jutting out, it was one of the most iconic parts of these gardens with the tower, and it's where things like the tightrope walking and fireworks and all that kind of stuff was set off in front of and around it. And it's also where this famous Peruvian mummy was kept, up in the tower.
The tower up on this chalk spur jutting out into the gardens was the watchtower. And it being so up high, it was one of the first things that visitors saw as they were approaching down the Thames. You had to pay a penny to climb up to the top, and inside was this Peruvian mummy. The mummy of a woman who potentially had come from Leicester Square. Nobody's 100% sure, but by 1846, she was in Rosherville. And apparently 20 years after that was basically disintegrating. And another 20 years after that, the mummy had disappeared. Or just, completely fallen apart. Although I'm also not discounting the chance that she woke up, stole the skin from somebody nearby, and hopped on a steamer back to Peru.
Now, as we work our way down from where the baronial hall was, we come to the far end of Rosherville Gardens, which is where the wilderness section was. And behind me where the Red Lion pub is, Leo's, was the maze.
The wilderness was a large, natural area, and visitors could do what they wanted here. They could picnic, they could walk around the lake. There was even a tunnel through that big spur of rock to get into the wilderness. And on the other side of the lake was the maze. You had to pay a penny to enter, where apparently a small boy in a green uniform was sat on a step ladder to direct people getting lost in the maze, which is hilarious because that is exactly how it still works now. We went to Leeds Castle recently, and there's still a guy stood at the top of the maze just looking for people who look like they don't know what they're doing. And on the other side of the maze was a gypsy tent where a woman called Avis Lee, who was from a local gypsy encampment, told fortunes, who apparently made about £4 a week from her fortune telling. Which, according to the Bank of England, is about 424 quid a week, so she wasn't doing too badly out of this. Avis Lee died in 1864, but fortune telling continued with various other people playing the role of the gypsy fortune teller.
As we round the corner from the Red Lion, you can basically see nothing. There's clear signs of the old industry that used to be here. There's just a lot of concrete and not a lot else. But you can just about see where the wilderness used to be here behind me. You can still see some of that nature trying to reclaim it by the looks of things now. These steps that I'm walking up now, that are just next to Rosherville Way, are not too far away from the steps that would have been here at this end of the gardens to get down the cliff. Well, I found my way back to London Road, which is where that clifftop entrance is. So we might as well walk back down past there, and I can give you another little snippet.
It was in 1869 that this new Clifftop London Road entrance was created, and they added a conservatory filled with beautiful plants. And it was this that you would initially walk through before descending the steps into the gardens. Think Kew Gardens, but in miniature. And along with this conservatory, there was an impressive octagonal clock tower, which contained 16 bells, which, as well as mirroring Big Ben performing the Westminster chimes, also performed a tune every hour, and every single day it performed a different tune.
So I'm back at Fountain Walk at the Clifftop entrance, because this is probably about as close as I can get to showing you what these old clifftop walks would have looked like. You look at some of the pictures, or at least the one picture I could find, that showed one of these clifftop walks, and it looks like this.
Alright, so it's not quite the same.
Now, I happen to know that when this estate that I'm walking on now was developed, and the clifftop entrance was closed down and everything was taken apart, that some of those statues were moved onto the estate. And I happen to know where one still remains, although she's seen better days. Just there is the bottom half of one of the statues that used to sit on one of those plinths at the old clifftop entrance. Now, that's the only one that I can see, but I know that the statues, most of them, were apparently moved onto this estate. But that one there is the only one that we can still see, or I can still find. Well, now I'm up here, I think I'm going to work my way back round to what used to be the main entrance.
On the 26th of June, 1872, George Jones died at the age of 76, and incredibly, his wife Charlotte died the next day at the age of 84. Both are buried together at Gravesend Cemetery. Unfortunately, when he died, he left considerable debts behind. In 1872, the gardens were sold for £24,600, or in 2025, somewhere between £2 and £3 million.
Well, I am now making my way down Birch Road, which is where the old main Birch Road entrance was to Rosherville Gardens. And you can already tell some of these houses behind me are definitely starting to get into that era. Well, behind me here was the grand entrance to Rosherville Gardens. People would have come off the paddle steamer at the pier just down from me, and they would have seen the grand entrance behind them, gone up, come out onto the grand terrace and seen down the Italian Gardens. None of that's here anymore. So here, where we're looking, would have been the two columns, the entrance in between, and just here, where this bathroom showroom is, I believe, was George Jones's actual house. So behind me here, where you can see these blue railings, was the old entrance to Rosherville Pier. So people would have come down from London on the paddle steamer, arrived here at the pier, and then streamed off literally in their thousands and worked their way up this road to the main entrance. And alongside the old pier entrance is actually another little reminder of what used to be here. There is a plaque, albeit surrounded by graffiti, that says exactly what happened here. And that this down below me was the old pier entrance. You can't quite see, but down below was an old tunnel. So if you were coming off the paddle steamer, you would have actually come directly through this tunnel, which would have taken you basically straight into the gardens. And there was an old ticket office down inside that tunnel underneath the road I'm stood on right now. You can also just about see down there an old mine watching post. Tiny little brick building down there that was intended to obviously keep an eye out for mines during the Second World War coming up and down the Thames. Well, as I can't get into the tunnel because that would be trespassing, and I don't condone trespassing, obviously, though, I'm going to try and work my way overground as close as I possibly can to the old route that people would have taken. We've left our paddle steamer. We've got George Jones' house on my right, the grand entrance ahead of me, and not this newish block of flats. And we've reached our first hurdle. Not getting into Rosherville Gardens that way. So we carry on, and just up here, I do believe we enter the car park of this block of flats. And behind me is a wall that looks just about old enough to have been here. And I think there is a good chance that coming through the entrance back there behind me would have brought you through to here, where this car park is. And then on old maps, it looks like the entrance would have bent round here and brought you out onto a path, which would have then led you to the terrace and the view over the Italian Gardens. So maybe, not definitely, but maybe, not this bit's definitely new, but maybe this section of wall made up part of that grand entrance. But as we can't get in that way anymore, I'm going to have to head back round the corner into the housing estate.
Apparently, the gardens were beautiful, and the pictures that survive do show this incredibly beautifully laid out garden with carefully tended flower beds. And apparently there were incredibly rare plants on display. Obviously this was supposed to be a botanical garden, and it seemed that the sheltered location of the garden surrounded by these cliffs was perfect for some of these plants to thrive. And all around the gardens were fountains, urns, and statues of goddesses, similar to those found at some of the entrances. And there were also 12 stone busts of great and famous writers. People like Homer, Shakespeare, Milton, and Byron. Although, apparently, over the years, these busts were not exactly well looked after, with one visitor in 1874 describing them as ugly busts of English poets. They went on to say, Lord Byron has lost his nose and upper lip, Cowper has suffered from an attempt to cave in his head, and Sir Walter Scott looks too much like a pudding. It seemed that the statues were more or less left to age naturally, if not gracefully.
Well, as we come back into the housing estate, I believe I would now find myself off to the side in the Italian Gardens. And if we head this way, I'm pretty sure we're going to make our way right to the centre of those gardens, where back in the day we would have been able to look one way up to the terrace, where streams of people would have been coming in, and the other way down to the bear pit, where what was essentially one of the main attractions, and again another one of the most iconic features of Rosherville, would have been. Behind me here, you can see that they have tried to commemorate or to honour what used to be here. So this is where the central gardens of this housing estate actually are, with a statue, an art piece to kind of commemorate where the bear pit is. And so where I would have been standing right now is where everybody would have streamed through the gardens when they first arrived.
There are some fond recollections of some of the gardeners that used to work there as well. Apparently a man called Old Blake, or John Blake, was particularly memorable, with one James Benson remembering, "He usually wore an old bowler hat, beneath the brim of which a pair of knowing grey eyes peered out, and a deep moustache covered both lips and well down to the chin. He shouted at the boys if they left the conservatory doors open, while the old cockatoo, with upturned, ruffled, canary-coloured tuft, supported him with a scream that was almost deafening. The monkeys would set up a jabbering noise as an addition to the din, while Old Blake would threaten with his stick. But when visitors asked him about his flowers and plants, his 'Yes, ma'am,' 'No, ma'am,' was all sweetness."
Quickly duck into this car park here. I believe that up there, behind me, is the car park that I was just stood in. So, this here would have been the grand terrace at the beginning of the gardens, where you would have come out onto this walkway, steps down into the gardens, and seen the gardens streaming away ahead of you. And now it's a car park. So, as I walk through the Italian Gardens, with the terrace up behind me there would have been beautiful flowers, a lot of flowers from America, from all over the place. And remember this was supposed to be like a botanical gardens before it turned into a pleasure garden. And off in each corner would have been a small aviary with some kind of tropical bird in it. Here in the centre would have been beautiful flower beds, and then up ahead of me here would have been the bear pit. Now they've put some kind of weird sculpture. I'm not quite sure how it's supposed to represent a bear pit, but art, what can I say? And so around the bear pit there used to be refreshment huts and seating for everybody to sit and watch. And where I'm about to walk into here was the pit. So right here, I guess these are supposed to look like waves. I don't know. I'll just put a big statue of a bear here, but maybe I'm not that imaginative. So this is where Rosie the bear would have sat and entertained the crowds.
And fascinatingly, during excavation for the estate that is now here, they actually uncovered the buried remains of the bear pit. And as it's a listed structure, they couldn't destroy it, thankfully, but they did just bury it again. I think it's a shame they couldn't preserve the actual structure in some way above ground, both to commemorate it and also possibly to mention why it's a good thing we don't keep bears in pits anymore.
Now I can't quite follow the exact path that used to be here without walking on the grass, so I'm going to walk round the side, and we're almost back to the bottom of our clifftop entrance where we started. But right here, where we're about to walk through, would have been the old Archery Ground.
The Archery Ground, which was just off the main terrace in the Italian Gardens, was run by a man named Signor Gomez, who apparently regularly just dressed as Robin Hood. He would not only entertain the crowds with his skill, but obviously also let others have a go at archery, and would occasionally demonstrate his ability to lasso his own son.
It's interesting, as I walk through what would have been the Archery Ground, is that the only thing that's really left here is the huge chalk walls. They're the only things that I think if somebody was coming back from that time and came back to the pleasure gardens for a visit, all they would recognise are the chalk cliffs and nothing else. If you listen very carefully, you can almost hear the whizzing of arrows flying past me.
Around the Archery Ground, in the cliffs, were caves. Now, when the gardens were supposed to be a cultured zoological botanical place, those caves were intended to house some of the animals. But by 1842 they only really had bears, monkeys and birds. So rather than housing lions, tigers, whatever else they'd had planned, they just became where the bears lived.
One of those was the Hermit's Cave. Again, it's another famous part of these gardens. But unfortunately, there's a good chance it's in somebody's back garden, or at least behind somebody's back garden, so I'm not sure if we're going to be able to see it, unless I can find a car park to dive into. Well, turns out we're good. Behind me here is the Hermit Cave in a car park. It looks like the only way you can get down into it is obviously blocked off, no one's going down there. But the only way down into it, you can see, is a ladder down there. It looks pretty tight down there. Not sure I'd love to have this in my back garden. I wonder if there's anything left of the hermit in there.
Birds could be seen throughout the gardens. There were aviaries around the Italian gardens, and there were also swans on the lake in the wilderness area, and plenty of other exotic birds just living throughout the gardens. Near the archery field was also a building called the Pavilion, but nobody really knows what went on there. It was something of a private area of the garden. Unfortunately, in 1878, one of Britain's worst disasters was unfortunately linked to the gardens. A paddle steamer called the Princess Alice had called to Gravesend to pick up passengers who were leaving from the gardens to head back to London. We don't know for sure, but what we do know is that there could have been between 700 and 900 people on board. Whatever it was more than her capacity. On her trip back up the Thames, she collided with a huge collier called the Bywell Castle and was essentially cut in half, sinking entirely within 5 minutes. Between 600 and 700 people drowned, including many women and children. And I've actually covered the Princess Alice disaster in depth on my channel, so feel free to go and check out that video. It's a really devastating tragedy. This disaster was a huge shock throughout the country, and ultimately could have had a role in people losing their trust in the Thames paddle steamers and moving more towards the railways. And even though the gardens had ultimately had nothing to do with it, the fact that many of the passengers on board had been at the gardens earlier that day meant that they were inextricably linked to this disaster. And it was after this that the noticeable decline in visitors coming to the gardens began. And over the following years, people having more easy access to trains meant that they could get further away from London for their summer outings. And so people were starting to head to the coastal towns. The cheaper cost of travel also meant that the gardens were becoming more accessible to what at the time was considered, let's say, a less respectable class of visitor. And from 1879, there are far more reports of disturbances, fights, drunken brawls, and everything that people didn't want to see at the gardens. Another sign of the problems with some of the new clientele was a huge increase in cruelty to the animals. There were reports of people attacking the bears and the monkeys. Though thankfully, apparently in 1885, one of the bears got his own back. When someone shoved their hand through the bars in his cage, he grabbed it and bit it. In an attempt to catch some of those people that were now travelling on train, a branch line was built off of the main line and a small station was opened just south of London Road, which did make the gardens more accessible to people, but was probably at this point too little, too late.
And believe it or not, that railway station used to be here. Yep, what is now the A226 used to be Rosherville Halt railway station. And I'm pretty sure there are no signs left of what used to be here, apart from the railway bridge just around the corner.
By 1900, it was clear that the gardens were beginning to show their age. And with business not going well, the owner at the time, Mr. Cochrane, applied for bankruptcy. In 1901, they were put up for sale, and when that failed, most of the fixtures and fittings were put up instead. This did bring in people who were clearly looking to get a little piece of memorabilia from the gardens. As for the animals, the monkeys that were still there were sold to Alexandra Palace. But the bear who was there at the time, Rosie, was not so lucky. She was only 3 years old at the time and was sold for 7.5 guineas to a Mr. MacDonald. When Mr. MacDonald's father-in-law said the smell of the bear would spook his horses, he refused to take it, and as there was nowhere else for Rosie to go, he arranged for her to be shot. After this was done, she was skinned and turned into a rug, with the rest of her being used by a local hotel for food. And until 1903, the gardens were left to overgrow. Walls bare of statues, buildings empty. But in 1903, a man called John Russell and his son started a new enterprise to reopen Rosherville Gardens. And they did in August 1903, managed by a man called Arthur Ernest Radcliffe. Now, because most of the stuff was gone, they had to make some changes. The rosary platform was gone, so they laid out rows of folding chairs. The outdoor stage was renamed to Café Chantant and painted to look like a chalet. The Bijou Theatre became a restaurant. The conservatory at that old London Road entrance was completely removed. The maze was swept away. The caverns along the cliff were reopened, but were used to house waxwork tableaus of various different tortures. And all of these changes seemed a little subpar compared to what used to be there. And so the gardens continued to attract fewer and fewer people, and the gardens became a lot more of a local attraction. They did get some new animals though. A new bear and some monkeys arrived. They also added a pair of Russian wolves. And apparently in 1905, a female baboon called Lena escaped, made her way to the Elephant's Head pub and jumped on the counter. Despite throwing stuff at her, nobody could get her down, and so they basically just hid in a side room. Until a little local girl who was used to feeding stuff to her in the gardens coaxed her away and took her back to the gardens, which must have been embarrassing for all of the fully grown adults in that pub. Over the next few years, the gradual decline of the gardens continued, and it seemed that almost every other year, the gardens sat closed. Then, of course, when the First World War came around, the gardens stayed closed throughout, and by the time the war was over, the gardens were in a very, very bad state, incredibly overgrown, and the buildings had also been vandalised and just deteriorated over time. There was a brief wave of encouragement for people to try and save the gardens again, but it ultimately failed. And by 1924, the garden was mostly in ruins, with the baronial hall falling apart and various other buildings basically falling down.
It's funny. Reminds me of visiting old seaside towns that used to be, you know, the height of sophistication and class and culture, where everybody would go for their summer holidays. And you just still see little bits of that class, little tiny bits of that culture now hidden in amongst, unfortunately, a lot of deprivation. It's funny because that's exactly what happened to Rosherville Gardens and why it's no longer here.
And over the next couple of years, the gardens were slowly sold off, bit by bit, to some local industry. What wasn't sold to industry became so overgrown that it basically disappeared, and became something like an actual wilderness, and a place for the local children to break into and get up to mischief.
You know what, I was going to walk around and be like, you know, woe is me, this place is a shithole. And it, you know, But you know what? It's less of a shithole than it was when I was growing up here.
In 1936, there was one last hurrah, when a small hospital fete to raise money for the local hospital was held in what was left of the grounds. But despite raising £5,000 for Gravesend Hospital, this was the last hurrah. And in 1938, Henley Cable Works, who had purchased the rest of the gardens, decided to extend over the rest of the gardens. And in 1939, the whole site was cleared. And this was very destructive. This is where any raised sections of the gardens were carved away to flatten the whole thing, and sections of cliff were cut right back to remove almost every sign of what had been there. The clock tower up at the London Road entrance, which by this time was derelict, was demolished. And with that went the final sign of Rosherville Gardens, 102 years after it had first been created. And where once this beautiful pleasure garden stood was now a grimy industrial estate.
It's not an industrial estate anymore, so it's at the very least better than it was, though it is missing that telltale stink of drunk teenagers falling out of the local pub. Well, and as we walk down this generic housing estate lane, we're coming back to the Clifftop entrance, which is where my journey today, or several weeks ago, began. And now that my trip to the Pleasure Gardens is concluded, there's only one real way to get home. I figured, why not end today by going home Victorian style? There's only one seagoing paddle steamer left in the world, and she's not sitting in a museum. Welcome to the PS Waverley. Launched on the 2nd of October 1946 in Glasgow, she was built for the London and North Eastern Railway to carry passengers on the Clyde estuary routes. She's named after Sir Walter Scott's famous novel, and she's powered by a triple expansion diagonal steam engine, which you can still see working on board. She had a bit of a close call in 1973 when she was withdrawn from service, destined for the scrapyard. But the Paddle Steamer Preservation Society stepped in and bought her for just £1. Since then, she's been painstakingly restored and now operates heritage cruises around Britain, from the Clyde to the Thames, where I am today. And since her return to service in 1975, she's carried over 6 million passengers. And she's even listed on the UK National Historic Fleet and proudly holds the title of the world's last seagoing paddle steamer. And just in case you were wondering, we did make it past where the Princess Alice met her end, all the way back to London on this incredible floating time machine. As always, if you enjoyed today's video, like, subscribe, leave a comment, and I'll try and get back to you, and I'll see you in the next one.